Picture a room where paper-thin suits and Ivy League degrees dictate who lives and who breaks. It's a place where a man's entire existence is reduced to a docket number, and the air smells of old leather, expensive cologne, and manufactured fear. On this specific Tuesday, Julian Vance, a high-priced defense attorney whose hourly rate could pay a year's mortgage on a family estate, stood before the mahogany bench. He was a predator in a tailored pinstripe armor, looking down his nose at a man who smelled faintly of diesel exhaust and turned earth. Silas Thorne sat at the defense table, his massive, calloused hands resting on the polished wood like two displaced boulders. Silas wore his only flannel shirt, the collar frayed, looking entirely like a man waiting for an executioner. Julian didn't just intend to win this civil land dispute, he intended to turn Silas into a public punchline, a warning to any local who dared stand in the way of corporate asphalt. He smirked, leaned into the microphone, and delivered a devastating, mocking evaluation of the old man's intellect that had the front rows snickering. But the courtroom went dead silent the exact millisecond the quiet, normally invisible court clerk cleared his throat, stood up, and spoke a single sentence that turned the entire room into ice. To understand how a man like Silas Thorne ended up in the crosshairs of a legal shark like Julian Vance, you have to understand the land. For 4 generations, the Thorne family had worked the valley. They knew which acres caught the morning mist, which soil held the heavy rains, and where the limestone ran deep beneath the topsoil. It wasn't just property, it was a living history book written in sweat and fence lines. But to the Oakhaven Development Group, represented by Julian, it was merely a blank canvas for a multi-million-dollar distribution hub. They had acquired the surrounding parcels through quiet buyouts and intimidation, leaving Silas's homestead as the final stubborn island in a sea of corporate expansion. Julian Vance didn't do compromise. He was a man who measured his self-worth by the size of his retainers and the despair of his opponents. When Silas refused the initial, insultingly low buyout offer, Julian didn't just advise his clients to raise the bid. He filed a predatory lawsuit, alleging ancient boundary discrepancies, zoning violations, and public nuisance claims designed to drain the old farmers' meager savings before they ever even saw a judge. Julian knew the system was a meat grinder for the uninitiated, and Silas was stepping directly into the gears without a lawyer of his own. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived with a gray, oppressive sky. The courtroom was packed with local residents, farmers who kept their caps in their hands, and a row of junior executives from Oakhaven, checking their gold watches. When Judge Thomas took the bench, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Julian moved with the practiced grace of a theater actor, scattering color-coded binders across his table with practiced authority. Silas sat alone, clutching a battered, faded leather ledger tied with a piece of frayed twine. Julian's opening statement wasn't just a legal argument, it was an execution of character. He painted Silas as a regressive obstructionist, a man clinging to outdated ideas of ownership while standing in the way of regional progress and job creation. He used complex legal jargon, citing obscure 19th-century property statutes and maritime boundary definitions, deliberately weaving a web of confusion designed to make the old farmer look utterly incompetent. Every time Silas tried to speak or raise his hand, Julian would swiftly cut him off with a sharp objection regarding protocol, turning to the gallery with a theatrical sigh that drew soft laughter from his corporate entourage. The mockery reached its peak when Julian brought up the old ledger. Silas had offered it as proof of an oral agreement made between his grandfather and the town's founding family, an agreement that guaranteed the Thorne family perpetual right-of-way access to the main valley road. Julian snatched the ledger from the table, holding it between 2 fingers as if it were a soiled rag. He laughed into the microphone, asking the court if they were seriously expected to base a multi-million-dollar infrastructure project on the chicken-scratch handwriting of a dead, uneducated laborer who probably couldn't read a modern blueprint. He openly mocked Silas's accent, his clothes, and his simple belief that a man's word, recorded in ink on yellowed paper, still held weight in a court of law. Silas didn't flinch, but his knuckles turned white against the edge of the table. He looked around the room, realizing that no one in authority was going to save him. The judge looked tired, skimming through Julian's beautifully bound brief, clearly swayed by the sheer volume of professional paperwork. Julian turned back to Silas, giving a final, patronizing smile, preparing to move for an immediate summary judgment that would evict the Thorne family by the end of the month. He believed he had played the perfect game, orchestrated the perfect humiliation, and secured an effortless victory. But Julian Vance had forgotten one crucial detail about old courtrooms. The most dangerous person in the room isn't always the one holding the microphone or wearing the robe. Sometimes, it's the person who sits in the shadows, recording every single word, holding the keys to the vault where the real truth is buried. Arthur Pendleton, the court clerk who had sat in that exact chair for 42 years, quietly adjusted his glasses, closed his logbook with a soft thud, and prepared to shatter Julian's perfect world. Arthur Pendleton did not look like an assassin of reputations. He was a small, slightly stooped man with silver hair that refused to stay combed and a woolen vest that had seen better days during the previous administration. For over 4 decades, he had been a permanent fixture of the county courthouse, as unchanging as the marble pillars out front. Lawyers came and went, judges retired, and entire political dynasties rose and fell, but Arthur remained, quietly typing, logging, and filing the history of the county. He was the living memory of the district, an archivist of human conflict who knew where every skeleton was buried because he had personally filed the death certificates. When Arthur stood up, the sheer anomaly of the movement caused Julian Vance to pause mid-sentence. Court clerks did not interrupt proceedings. They did not speak unless spoken to, and they certainly did not cut off a high-powered attorney in the middle of a closing argument. Judge Thomas looked up from his legal pad, his eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge asked, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the room. "Is there an issue with the record?" Arthur did not look at the judge. He looked directly at Julian, his eyes remarkably sharp behind his thick lenses. He reached into a faded green expanding file folder that had been sitting unobtrusively beneath his desk all morning. "There is an issue with the foundation of the plaintiff's entire motion, Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice carrying a calm, resonant authority that stunned the gallery. "Mr. Vance has spent the last 20 minutes characterizing the defendant's family ledger as a piece of irrelevant fiction. He has argued that the 1904 oral agreement between the Thorne estate and the town's founders lacks any corroborating legal framework in the modern county registry." Julian scoffed, recovering his composure quickly. He adjusted his silk tie and smirked at the gallery. "Your Honor, with all due respect to the clerk's long tenure here, he is not legal counsel. If he has a filing error to report, he can do so after I finish my motion. Right now, we are discussing a clear-cut property dispute where my client holds the only valid, modern deed registered with the state." "That is where you are incorrect, Mr. Vance," Arthur replied smoothly, pulling a large, heavy leather-bound volume from his green folder. The spine was cracked, and the pages were thick, yellowed parchment. "You see, when the Oakhaven Development Group digitized the county property records 5 years ago to facilitate their land acquisitions, they utilized a third-party contractor. That contractor made a fatal error. They scanned the active deeds, but they completely omitted the original colonial land grants and the subsequent foundational codicils that were established when this county was chartered." A murmur rippled through the back rows. Silas Thorne slowly raised his head, his tired eyes fixing on the old clerk. Julian's smirk flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before hardening into a scowl. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The clerk is introducing unvouched materials outside the discovery period." "This is not outside the discovery period, Mr. Vance," Arthur countered, opening the massive book to a heavily annotated page marked with a red silk ribbon. "This is Volume 4 of the Master County Charter of 1882. It is the permanent legal bedrock upon which every single deed in this valley is built. It cannot be altered, it cannot be bought, and it cannot be digitized away by a negligent contractor." Arthur stepped away from his desk, carrying the heavy ledger toward the bench with a deliberate, slow stride. The courtroom was so quiet that the rhythmic creaking of his leather shoes sounded like gunshots. He placed the book directly in front of Judge Thomas. "If Your Honor will look at paragraph 6, subsection B," Arthur pointed with a withered finger. "You will find the original charter for the Valley Road. When the town founders established the commercial route, the land was granted by Silas Thorne's great-grandfather, Elijah Thorne. But it was granted under a strict, perpetual restrictive covenant. The condition of the land transfer explicitly states that the Thorne family retains absolute veto power over any commercial development that alters the natural hydrology or accessibility of the valley floor. Judge Thomas leaned forward, pulling his reading glasses down his nose. He began to read, his face growing progressively paler with every line. Julian Vance stepped toward the bench, his confident stride suddenly turning rigid. "Let me see that," he demanded, abandoning his theatrical courtroom persona. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, his voice cutting through Julian's rising panic, "the handwritten ledger that Mr. Vance so eloquently mocked isn't a collection of chicken scratch. It is the exact, legally required logbook mandated by that 1882 covenant. Every oral agreement, every boundary adjustment, and every usage right-of-way was required to be recorded in that specific family ledger and signed off by a town magistrate. If Mr. Vance had bothered to check the actual historical archives instead of relying purely on a flawed digital database, he would have known that the ledger in his hand is not a piece of trash. It is a legally binding, supreme title document that supersedes his client's modern deed." Julian snatched his hand away from Silas's ledger as if it had suddenly caught fire. The corporate executives in the front row began whispering furiously, their faces flushed with anger and confusion. Julian looked at the paper in his hand, then at the massive book on the judge's bench, realizing in a terrifying flash that the entire foundation of his multi-million-dollar lawsuit had just dissolved into thin air. He had spent months constructing a legal trap for an old farmer, only to realize he had walked his own clients directly into an unmitigated disaster. The atmosphere in the courtroom transformed instantly from a clinical legal proceeding into a theater of high-stakes panic. Julian Vance stood frozen at the bench, his fingers twitching against the fabric of his expensive trousers. For a man who built his career on absolute control, the sudden realization that he was completely defenseless was an entirely intoxicating kind of terror. He stared down at the ancient ledger open before Judge Thomas, watching the judge's eyes track across the elegant, fading calligraphy of the 1882 covenant. Every second of silence from the bench felt like a physical blow to the Oakhaven corporate legal team. "Your Honor," Julian stammered, his voice cracking slightly before he caught himself and forced a tone of professional indignation. "Even if this document is authentic, it is completely unreasonable to expect a modern multi-state development corporation to be bound by an unindexed, archaic restriction that wasn't included in any title insurance search. My clients acted in absolute good faith based on the active state registry." Judge Thomas slowly looked up from the parchment, his expression carved from stone. He looked at Julian, then at the frantic executives whispering in the front row, and finally down at Silas Thorne, who still sat quietly, his weathered hands flat on the defense table. "Mr. Vance," Judge Thomas said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "In this Commonwealth, a restrictive covenant attached to a foundational land grant does not expire simply because a computer program failed to scan it. It is the absolute responsibility of the purchasing party to perform due diligence. If your title insurance company failed to check the physical archives of this county, your recourse is with them, not with this court. And certainly not at the expense of a citizen's constitutional property rights." Julian felt a cold sweat break out along his collar. He turned to look at Arthur Pendleton, the old clerk who had already sat back down at his small desk. Arthur was casually adjusting his fountain pen, looking for all the world like a man who had done nothing more significant than filing a routine motion for a traffic violation. He didn't gloat, he didn't even smile. He simply returned to his work, leaving Julian to drown in the deep water he had foolishly waded into. The lead executive from Oakhaven, a sharp-faced man named Montgomery, stood up from the gallery and stepped past the wooden bar of the court, completely ignoring protocol. "Your Honor," Montgomery interrupted, his voice laced with corporate arrogance. "We have already poured $12 million into the grading and infrastructure of the adjacent parcels. We have contracts signed with global shipping logistics networks. This valley cannot be held hostage by a single acre of dirt and a 100-year-old piece of paper." Judge Thomas slammed his gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack that caused Montgomery to jump back a step. "Sit down, sir, or you will find yourself spending the night in a county holding cell for contempt. You do not address this bench from the gallery, and you do not dictate economic necessity to a court of law." The judge turned his attention back to Julian Vance. "Mr. Vance, the language of the 1882 covenant is completely unambiguous. The Thorne family holds absolute veto power over any development that impacts the water table or restricts access to the Valley Road. Furthermore, the logbook provided by the defendant, the very logbook you characterized as irrelevant fiction, contains the authorized signature of Magistrate William Vance, your own great-grandfather, who ratified this exact agreement in the summer of 1912. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. A collective gasp rose from the local farmers sitting in the back rows. Julian's face drained of color entirely, turning a sickly, translucent white. He looked down at the signature page the judge was pointing to, recognizing the distinct, looping cursive of his own family's ancestral legal patriarch. His own great-grandfather had signed a document that guaranteed the Thorne family's protection. The very history Julian had attempted to mock and erase was deeply intertwined with his own bloodline. Silas Thorne finally spoke, his voice deep, gravelly, and steady. "I tried to tell you, Mr. Vance. When your folks first came to this valley, we didn't use lawyers to build walls. We used handshakes to build roads. My granddad helped your granddad clear the timber for your family's first homestead. We recorded it all in that book so nobody would ever forget." Julian could feel the eyes of every person in the room burning into the back of his neck. The junior associates he had brought along to handle his paperwork were staring down at their laps, completely detached from their lead counsel. The corporate empire he had spent months representing was collapsing under the weight of a single, undigitized truth. Judge Thomas closed the heavy leather volume with a resounding thud that signaled the definitive end of the argument. The court finds that the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment is completely without merit. Not only is the motion denied, but this court is issuing an immediate, temporary injunction halting all construction and grading operations by the Oakhaven Development Group within the valley perimeter until a full environmental and hydrological impact study can be conducted under the strict oversight of the Thorne estate. The judge looked directly at Julian, his eyes narrowing. "And Mr. Vance, given your complete failure to conduct proper historical due diligence before filing these predatory motions, this court is referring your firm to the State Bar Association for an inquiry into abusive litigation practices. This court is adjourned." While the sound of Judge Thomas's gavel still echoed through the mahogany courtroom, signaling an unbelievable victory for Silas Thorne, the true story was only beginning to unravel in the shadows. To the casual observer in the gallery, this looked like the classic end of a standard legal drama, the small-town farmer defeating the greedy corporate conglomerate through a forgotten piece of paper. But as Julian Vance frantically shoved his color-coded files into his leather briefcase, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and humiliation, he noticed something that the judge, the executives, and even Silas had completely missed. Arthur Pendleton, the quiet court clerk who had just single-handedly dismantled a multi-million-dollar land acquisition, was not putting the 1882 Master County Charter back into the green expanding folder. Instead, he kept his withered finger pressed firmly against a completely different section of the yellowed parchment, his eyes locked onto Julian with a cold, knowing look that made the attorney's blood run cold. Julian, driven by a desperate instinct for survival, looked past the judge's bench and caught a glimpse of the text beneath Arthur's hand. There, written in the same elegant, faded ink, was a secondary clause attached to the 1912 ratification, a clause that didn't just protect the Thorne farm, but explicitly mentioned an entirely separate, secret land trust held under the Vance family name that had been completely hidden from the public record for over a century. Why would a simple court clerk risk his entire 42-year career to stage such a theatrical intervention in a routine civil hearing? If Arthur Pendleton had possessed this definitive historical ledger all along, why did he wait until the absolute final second of Julian's closing argument to reveal it, allowing Silas Thorne to endure weeks of public mockery and psychological terror? The answers to these questions go far deeper than a simple dispute over a valley road, stretching back to an unsolved conspiracy that nearly burned the county courthouse to the ground in the winter of 1974. The open loop that began to form in that quiet courtroom points to a much larger, darker reality hidden beneath the fertile soil of the valley floor. The Oakhaven Development Group wasn't actually trying to build a distribution hub. They had spent $12 million on grading adjacent parcels not for asphalt, but to unearth something specific that had been buried beneath the limestone shelf during the height of the state's industrial boom. Julian Vance was starting to realize that he hadn't just been hired as a legal muscle, he had been used as a shield by his own clients to keep everyone's eyes fixed on a fake property boundary line while the real operation took place just a mile north. But the most terrifying realization was creeping into Julian's mind as he watched Silas Thorne carefully tie the frayed twine around his old leather ledger. Silas didn't look surprised. The old farmer hadn't cheered when the judge ruled in his favor, he hadn't even smiled at the corporate executives who were currently screaming into their cell phones in the hallway. He simply stood up, adjusted his frayed flannel collar, and looked at Arthur Pendleton with a silent, heavy nod of understanding. It was a look shared between two men who knew a secret that could tear the entire county apart if it ever leaked out of the room. What did Silas's grandfather actually trade to Magistrate William Vance in the summer of 1912 in exchange for that perpetual right-of-way? The old ledger held more than just handshakes and boundary lines. Tucked between the rear pages were receipts for structural steel and shipping manifests from an old mining company that had vanished from the state records overnight. If Julian's great-grandfather had used his judicial authority to lock this land away under a supreme covenant, it wasn't to protect a farmer's access to a road, it was to ensure that no one would ever have the legal right to dig deep enough to find what lay hidden beneath the Thorne family homestead. As the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only the hum of the old fluorescent lights and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, Julian stepped toward the clerk's desk. His voice was a whisper, completely stripped of its former arrogance. "You knew," Julian said, staring at the ancient book. "You didn't find this by accident today. You've been waiting for me to bring this exact lawsuit." Arthur Pendleton slowly closed the master charter, the heavy leather cover making a sound like a closing vault. He looked up at the disgraced attorney, a faint, dangerous shadow of a smile touching his lips. "Mr. Vance, your great-grandfather knew that greed would eventually bring your family back to this valley. He left this ledger here because he knew you would be the one to try and destroy his work. But you've only opened the first door. If I were you, I'd be much more worried about what your clients are going to do tonight when they realize they can't dig up that limestone." This jaw-dropping courtroom showdown leaves us with a question that completely changes how we look at history: who was truly pulling the strings behind the scenes? Was it the quiet, unassuming court clerk who held on to a century-old secret until the exact moment it could destroy a corrupt legal empire? Or did the old farmer, Silas Thorne, understand the true value of his family's land all along, playing the victim just to lure a predatory development corporation into a multi-million-dollar trap? The terrifying truth is that in a world ruled by digitized records and corporate buyouts, the most dangerous weapon isn't a high-priced attorney or a massive bank account, it's the physical, unalterable proof of the past that someone tried to bury. Now, look closely at your own life and the history of your own hometown. Have you ever noticed an old, abandoned piece of land, a strange boundary line, or an ancient building that modern developers seemingly refuse to touch, no matter how valuable the area becomes? It makes you wonder what kind of forgotten covenants, handshakes, or hidden family secrets are quietly resting in the dusty basements of your local county courthouse right now. If you enjoyed watching Julian Vance's arrogant corporate defense completely fall apart under the weight of a single handwritten signature, drop a comment below right now and tell me your favorite part of this incredible legal twist. Do you think Julian deserves to lose his license for trying to exploit a hard-working farmer, or was he just another oblivious pawn in a much bigger game played by his own ancestors? Let me know your theories about what is actually buried beneath that limestone shelf in the comments section, because I read every single one of them. If this story proved to you that honesty, heritage, and a man's word still hold power against absolute greed, make sure to hit that thumbs up button and like this video. Sharing this video with your friends and family helps us bring more hidden stories of justice, courage, and unexpected triumphs to light. To make absolutely sure you never miss another high-stakes courtroom twist or incredible historical mystery, click that subscribe button right now and turn on all post notifications. By subscribing to the channel, you become part of a community that values the deep truths and hidden histories that modern society tries to smooth over with corporate asphalt. If you are ready for your next deep dive into a world where the underdog completely flips the script on the powerful, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. In that next story, we explore an entirely different case where an arrogant city developer thought he could bully an isolated mountain community out of their ancestral valley, only to discover that the locals possessed a terrifying historical leverage that changed the region forever. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Keep hunting for the truth, and I will see you in the very next story.